All right, there we go. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the asset pipeline. And yeah, I have some things that are on my list to talk about and to show, and but really hoping that you guys have some questions that we can dive into. So yeah, I'm just going to start from the beginning. What the asset pipeline is. So the asset pipeline provides a framework that will minify, concatenate, compress JavaScript, CSS, images for us in our Rails projects. It'll also allow us to pre-process things such as CoffeeScript, Sass, ERB, or any other thing that we might add on. But by default, it can natively work with those things. It also allows things to automatically be versioned, which we'll look at a little bit and see how that works. Yeah, so that's the kind of 30,000 foot view of what the asset pipeline is. Now, when you create a new Rails app, and I just did Rails new asset pipeline for this app, and that's all that I've done so far with it. Just created it a few minutes ago. Rails is automatically going to add some things to our gem file for us. So it's not that Rails, the framework, inherently can do these things, but when you generate a new Rails app using the Rails new generator, it's going to say, okay, I need to add some things to the gem file to enable these things. So if we look, we see we have this Sass Rails. So that's enabling Sass. We have this uglifier, which is going to be doing some compressing of our JavaScript assets. We have this Coffee Rails, which is going to allow CoffeeScript. So while some things are available, quote unquote, out of the box, they're not necessarily built in, so to speak, with Rails. There are additional gems that Rails is just installing for us from the get-go. If you wanted to, you could do Rails new if you did Rails new, your app name, and then -- skip - sprockets, it wouldn't install those gems for you. So there's something to know if you don't want them, or you don't want to go through uninstalling them. You just want one or something, or you want to use less, and you don't want to use CoffeeScript and don't want to use uglifier, then just skip it in the beginning and just not have it from the get-go. Inside of our config, let's see, production, and here's a couple options that have to do with the asset pipeline. And that has to do with what is used to compress. So here we have the uglifier for JS compressor. The Sass Rails gem is automatically used for CSS compression when it's included in the gem file, and that is why there's nothing set for this. So if that wasn't there and we wanted to do something, we would have to set this. But that's the only little bit of config if you want to change those things from the defaults that Rails does. Now, our asset pipeline, the files live in this app folder or this assets folder, sorry, under the app folder. And that's where all of our actual images, actual JavaScript files, actual CSS files or Sass files or SCSS files or what have you will live. in our project. Now, excuse me. Now, what I was talking about before, where it's going to, or Rails is going to, quote unquote, version things. It's going to do something called fingerprinting. So let me just create a file. So we see in this JavaScript folder, we can see it even better now, that we have two JavaScript files. So we have this application.js and this cable.js. Now, oh, there it is. Now, when we load this, so sprockets, sorry, the question is, I'm not entirely clear what sprockets does. So sprockets is, if I remember correctly, just this system. It's how the asset pipeline is being implemented. So sprockets is Rails implementation of the asset pipeline. So now, sorry guys. Eventually I'll stop having something stuck in my throat. So sprockets is the Rails implementation of the asset pipeline. So sprockets is a gem, sprockets Rails gem, and that's what's enabled by default for the asset pipeline. So everything that we're going to talk about is the default Rails asset pipeline structure. Now, as of, what was it, Rails 4.2, I believe, there were some gems that you could use besides sprockets. As of Rails 5.1, I believe, you could generate new projects using different asset pipeline structures. So, yeah, as Dave's saying, asset packager. So think of it as similar to bundler for JavaScript and CSS. And it's taken over the logic, so to speak, of how it's going to do these things. So another popular one in the JavaScript world is Webpack. So now you can generate Rails projects that use the Webpack asset management. So I guess asset management would be the best phrase for that system. It uses something called the Webpacker gem, but that's a way that you can also manage your assets. So sprockets is just an implementation of that. You're welcome. Rack-based asset packaging system is how Sprockets defines itself. It's a library for compiling and serving web assets. It features declarative dependency management for JavaScript and CSS assets, as well as a powerful preprocessor pipeline that allows you to write assets in languages like CoffeeScript, Sass, and SCSS. Okay, fingerprinting. So fingerprinting is something that's very useful, and I have run against this when I haven't been using Rails and seen the pains of it. So browsers want to do their best to not download everything every single time you go to a web page. So if you've been there before, you know, it's going to look and say, oh, I have this same exact file, name, and so I'm not going to download it again because, you know, I already have it. And that's going to save some time. It's going to make the experience quicker. However, we run into this problem where what happens when application.js has the same exact name and it looks exactly the same, but we've changed something in it. You know, require flat iron, and now we've added a flatiron.js file in here. So now we have this. I guess the tree would get it anyway, but so we don't have to explicitly do that just yet. But we've added this file, and the application's picking it up, and it's actually some different JavaScript now. But the browser's like, oh, I just see application.js, and it's looking fine, so that's cool. I'm going to use that again. Now, like I said, I've run into this before where you change some JavaScript or some CSS, and you don't see it reflected on the page even after a refresh. You have to end up doing what's called a hard refresh. I don't always remember the key combinations to accomplish that, but it's neither here nor there. I'm sure you can look them up for whatever browser and operating system you're using, real quick and easy. But that forces the browser to re-download everything associated with that page. Shift F5. I guess that's for, is that for Chrome? I don't know. I use Firefox and Opera and Chrome, and I use everything for some odd reason. So what the asset pipeline does for us is every time we make a change, it's going to fingerprint our assets. So I guess I'll take a step back from that and talk a little bit more about what the asset pipeline is doing. So it's taking all of our files in this folder, and as I was saying at the beginning, it's minifying them. So it's squashing out all the extra spaces. It's compressing them. It's getting them as small as possible, because as we shoot things across the web, we want them to be as small as possible, so that it's no matter what type of connection you're on, it makes things faster. So it's taking all the files. We see we require one file, we require turbo links, and then we require tree period. And that tree period is going to be every file in this JavaScript folder. So as we add more JavaScript into here, as we add more things into here, it's going to keep bundling them together into one single file. It's going to squash them all together. And that way also, web browsers typically only open a certain number of connections to a server. So if you had, and you'll notice this in Rails too, if you work on a large project, when you're in the development mode, it doesn't do this for you. So it's going to load all the files independently with their structure, and that's for debugging purposes. So that, when you look at a file, you can actually, when you trace something and you inspect it, you can actually get to where it is in the code. When it's minified, it's not nearly as pretty. If you've ever taken a look at, we can look at the difference between the two. But with that, it's going to take all the files and squash them together into one single file. It's going to do its compression on it. It's also going to ensure that, as the web browser only has, I think, typically five connections. I could be completely wrong on that. But if you have one CSS file, one JavaScript file, your HTML, and then images, it's going to be able to start downloading all of those at the same time, and start working on those things, at least the ones that are presented to it first. So that way you can get all of your stuff loaded. And let's just look for something. You can just look at like Bootstrap. I just want to look at the two different. So here is the CSS. You should be able to just open that. So here's the regular CSS. Like looks like some CSS that we might write. And then the minified CSS. Just everything squashed together. Now, as files grow, all that white space and stuff does add to file size, so it does save space. But yeah, you wouldn't want to debug something in here. It's going to be almost impossible to figure out where things are. But the browser and a computer can read that just fine. It reads that just like looking at this. And that's why they're computers and we're humans. But yeah, so what's happening is it's taking our CSS from something like this, squashing it into this, into a single file, and then it's going to do what I was talking about, fingerprinting. So it's going to say something like, I actually had an example. It's going to do something like this. If you're using a recent version of Rails, it's going to input a hash. Old Rails input a timestamp, a date-based query string on everything, but they've since changed that. But so now you'll have something like that, and something like, I'm not going to be able to get another one of these randomly, so I'll just copy that one. .js, and now when you make a change, all that's going to happen is this hash is going to change. So let's say, var school equals flat iron. Of this variable, it's new. This is going to regenerate and be something different. And this one is no longer gonna let's do that. No longer going to exist anymore. What this is telling our browser is, hey, the JavaScript's changed because it's looking for this file that it has in its cache or in a cookie somewhere, and saying, or in cache, and it's saying, oh, that file is no longer there, but this file is, so I need to re-download this again. So that's something that Rails takes care for us. That is a very nice feature. Because like I said, I've dealt with not having that, and it can be a pain. Because it's not a good user experience to tell a user, oh, things aren't working right. You need to do a hard refresh of your browser. It's like, well, no, well, it should just work. So we're seeing our file structure, app assets. We have our images, our JavaScript, our style sheets. And what's going to happen is do we have any? Okay. We can get to here at least. Let's see, what Mailer brings up for us, if anything. This one. Okay, didn't think so. So all right, I think it's a little bit easier to see the code when it's a tiny bit smaller. So our web server in Rails is going to automatically serve our static files from our public directory. And we don't see that. Here it is, down here, or reduce. We don't see anything in here right now, but that's where it's going to serve our static files from. So we might think, why shouldn't we place all of our JavaScript image and style sheet things there? And the first thing is, nothing in that file is going to get pre-processed. Nothing, it's going to be exactly like it is when you write it. So I can get pre-processed, compiled, compressed. So when we're putting things there, this is where we can bypass the asset pipeline. We see, these static 404 pages. We're not going to mess with these 422, 500. So if we go here, let's see, I should be able to hit this. we're sorry, but something went wrong. We don't want anything, we want these to be exactly how we write them. 404. And our robots. So that's one reason why we wouldn't put it there. And another reason is we also lose the ability to easily reference them from within our Rails code. So if we look at our, let's look at our application HTML ERB. When we put something, so we already have two examples here included for us. We have this style sheet link tag application, and that's taking our application.css that's here and including it and everything that comes along with it with some ERB tags. And the same is going for our JavaScript. JavaScript include tag, application. This is some TurboLinks stuff. TurboLinks is also part of site optimization. It can cause some issues with things. If you're working on your jQuery project or getting close to your jQuery project, a piece of advice that I was given, and I think it just continues to be passed along, is first thing you do, just uninstall TurboLinks from your project. It's just a gem. It's going to try and do some of the same things where once your JavaScript is loaded, it should just be a gem. Maybe it's not. Yeah, there it is. It's going to try and preload JavaScript and not reload it if it doesn't need to and it hasn't changed. But it can get in the way of some dynamic things. So if you're having problems in your jQuery project, your portfolio project, think about just dropping that out. We're not building apps that are so massive that we're even really going to see a performance benefit, in my opinion, with TurboLinks there. So if we put an image in this images folder, so here's an image. If that was in our public folder, we wouldn't have an easy way to get to it. However, if it's in our assets folder, we can just include it pretty simply with something like this. Image tag. What is that? Image. I guess that's not a good name for an example. Just call it flat iron. And what that's going to output is going to be something like this. And it's also going to put the hash on here. So something, I'll just hash. So that's going to net us that. If we had put it in our public folder, so let's say a folder, go images, and there we have flat iron 2. We can access that as well. However, we lose some of our benefits. And that will output something along the lines of so this, while it will still work, has a couple downfalls. One, it's only going to work if the site is being served from the base directory. So sometimes, you know, sites won't be served necessarily from right here. The base directory, sometimes there's, you know, something else that's occupying a section of the website at the base directory, and you'll have, you know, your app will be inside of here type of thing. And if that's the case, then everything in there will break. And then also we lose the versioning. So the same way that if our JavaScript or CSS changed, if that image changed, if, you know, we found out, oh, we didn't compress this down at all for the web, it's still the raw output from Photoshop, and it's like a 2 meg file, and it could be, you know, 100K and still look just as good, then browsers aren't going to pick that up. They're not going to download the new one, and they're going to keep pulling the old one and using the old one. Or if there's a logo, and, you know, the logo just changes, and that it might keep its same name because, you know, it's right in the same spot, it's the same size, you just want to change it out. We're going to lose that type of functionality without those hard refreshes. Let's see, what else is good? So, any questions so far?
I guess I just have a quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
So just to clarify, anything that is in the assets folder will fingerprint, but anything in the public or lib folder will not?
Correct.
Okay.
So anything in this public folder, Rails isn't going to touch. It's going to leave it completely alone. As it is how it's going to go out.
Okay.
Okay, so if you're wondering if everything, let's say everything put in this JavaScript folder, would be automatically precompiled for the app, there's a way to specify which files are compiled and in which order. So by default, our application CSS are CSS, application JS. And all of the non-JavaScript and non-CSS assets and any equivalent application, you know, CoffeeScript or application SaaS, that would replace those. However, we can include files in two different ways outside of these. So one is to include them in our applications or application files. So we have, you know, the requires in each, and this is the default sprockets style. If we were to change this to a application.sass, this would no longer be how we would do this. We would be doing at imports I can change that back. And honestly, this is the main way that I've ever seen it done. However, well, there's also a manifest where we can add things, config. So we have in these folders, either in the manifest or the actual application JS or CSS or equivalent. And then we have a precompile array. And that is available in our config, initializers, assets. So we see this Rails application config assets precompile, and it's an array. This %w is another way of saying create an array out of this. That %w is going to be exactly equivalent to it's a little bit cleaner when you're going to have a lot of things, just because you don't have to put commas between everything. But yeah, it's equivalent to that if you haven't seen that before. It's just saying precompile additional assets. So we have application.js, application.css, all non.js, CSS, and the app and assets folder are already added. So this would be to precompile some other things. And this would be the best fit for files that it makes sense are only included on certain pages. Hence, I think the default inclusion, the example of some admin stuff. So we have a portion of our site that will be used as an iframe, embedded widget, or we have, our admin section, and we only want that on there. So we could add those to the precompile array here. So with that, we would have them available in our application the same way with the include tag or link tag, image tag, etc. However, they wouldn't be bundled into the main asset pipeline file, the singular large file that's taking, typically almost everything in that folder, if not everything, and putting it all together into one file. So we could just define a couple things here. This is also a great way to include things in a way that can be more performant, especially now looking at, single page applications, JavaScript applications. I worked on an application that had, a ton of JavaScript in it, but we wanted our home page, the page you land on first, to load really, really, really fast. And we were like, how do we do that? So we actually didn't implement it this way, although this would be a really good way to do it now that I've dove deeper into the asset pipeline, doing this lecture and getting ready for it. But that way, we could say, we could have just a different set of CSS and JavaScript for that one page, and then load the rest of it, after the yield, after the main part of the page has loaded on that home page. Because everyone's going to hit the home page at some point in time. They have to get there. They have to log in. They have to do something. So we could throw it on the home page, and then you go to the home page, you get there, you load just enough JavaScript and CSS to style that page and to get anything that's on that page needed working. So your page loads. You're sitting there on the home page, you're able to do what you need to do while all the rest of your JavaScript is loading after all the main content. And that would be a great spot to use something like this precompile array. Um, let's see. We're moving along a little bit quicker than I thought we would. Something else that's cool to know is the asset pipeline will automatically evaluate ERB. So let's new file. Styles. So let's, there we go. I just want to grab, I'm going to have to write it. Home. Here, container. There's just some stuff. So here's some CSS. Now, we could do something like this. We have our container. I guess that's not, I could just, let's just say we have our body, and let's say we want a background. I'm going to have a URL. In here, we could do something like equals or not image, flat iron, got our closing brackets. Oh, and then we would need to rename this. .erb. So if you add that .erb after your .css, now you can write ERB tags inside of your CSS. Maybe even inside of your JavaScript, although that would get really confusing. So this is going to write the path to the specific asset being referenced. So in this instance, it would be app assets image flatiron.jpg. Now, if getting into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts, if this file is already referenced in public, it's already been processed and fingerprinted, it's going to go there and grab it. And that's where it's going to reference. And yeah, you can use ERB in your JavaScript. I think you might get confused personally, but it's possible, and it's supported natively by the asset pipeline when you're using sprockets. So you do need to make sure that you're including everything in this file. Require tree is how it comes first. So this is saying require everything in this folder with this period, and then require self. However, not with the CSS as much as I've seen, but with the JavaScript, you'll find that there are specific files that typically are specific gems that need to be loaded in a certain order to work. So it's going to work its way down through this list. So first it's loading Rails UJS, then it's loading TurboLinks, then it's loading all the JavaScript files. So knowing sometimes that things need to come in specific orders or in different orders, this is where you're going to have to define that. And these files can get really big really quickly. And there's nothing wrong with that. You want to make sure that you're keeping control over the files that you're serving, and not just, every single file. Well, it should be useful when it's in there. It isn't always. I guess I'll give another example of just the difference. We saw the hash before, and how in production, how we'll see a bunch of different or singular files, but in development we won't. So let's say we don't do require tree, and we have require flat iron, require learn, require zoom. I'll just make those files. What we would see output in our HTML on our page, if we viewed a source or inspected it, would look something like learn.js and zoom.js. So don't be confused or think that something's wrong if, when you're working on your project and looking at it on your development server, that it looks like this, and you see all of your JavaScript files or all of your CSS files and think, what's going on, what's wrong? This is what happens during development, like I said before, so that if there's an issue inside one of these files, it's much easier to debug. You can pinpoint it down to the file, to the line. It's still going to have all of its formatting like it does in the code that you've written, as opposed to being minified. So that's, I think, a good place to wrap this evening, on my side at least. We have about 10 minutes left, so let's just step back through some of the things we looked at. We looked at what the asset pipeline is made up of. We have sprockets, which is the kind of the core of it, but it also comes by default with this Sass Rails, this uglifier, and this coffee Rails built into it. We also looked at where the files live in this assets folder. We looked at how we can use files from the asset pipeline and how we can reference them using style sheet link tag, JavaScript include tag, image tags. We talked about how the public folder is going to keep static files and not touch or modify the files at all when we use those files, and how we can reference those as well. We discussed the fact that the asset pipeline is going to add a hash to our files that are in it. And that way we can know, well, the browser can know when those files have changed and when there's a new one to download the fresh one, as opposed to using the older cached version and waiting for that to expire, whenever that might be. We looked a little bit at the structure of one of these application files and how we're going to add in the files one by one, or use our require tree. Require tree doesn't have to be just a period. Can we, require tree, required or something. And in there, you have all of the files that you want on, or all the JavaScript you want on every page. And then you could, have things in our precompile array and just include those on the pages that you need them. We looked at how we could use ERB natively and input ERB tags in Ruby into our CSS and JavaScript if we so choose. We talked about how things are precompiled and compressed and minified and managed for us. And we talked about how there is the difference between the development and production version of the files that Rails is going to output for us. I feel like we talked about one other thing, but I don't remember. So with that short little recap, any questions, comments, anything that I can answer for you guys and gals? You're all very welcome. Before you go,